My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 38 years old, and I have spent over a decade working in financial analysis, specifically in risk assessment and investment structuring. When companies have millions of dollars on the line and something feels wrong, I am the person they call. I don't guess. I verify. I don't gamble with numbers. I calculate them. I built my parents' entire financial system from the ground up, every spreadsheet, every projection model, every safeguard that kept their business stable through difficult years. And the so-called mistake they love to remind everyone about? It wasn't a failure. It was a warning I gave them that they chose to ignore. So when my father raised his glass that night, smiled at 22 guests, and called me his idiot daughter, he was standing on a foundation I had built. And he had absolutely no idea what was coming. Thank you for listening to my story of betrayal, resilience, and justice. I love to know where you're watching from. Are you on your commute, taking a break at work, or cozy at home? Share it in the comments so we can connect and swap stories like this together. If this story pulled you in, don't forget to subscribe, give it a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next real-life drama. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation and the justice going. The dining room was full. 22 people, family, friends, business contacts, and several faces I didn't recognize but recognized the type of immediately. Expensive watches. Quiet confidence. The kind of people who don't attend dinner parties. They attend opportunities. My father stood at the head of the table, glass raised, commanding the room the way he always had. He introduced my mother, my younger brother Owen, a few colleagues. Then he turned to me. His smile didn't waver. And this, he said, with a casual wave in my direction, is our idiot daughter. The one who could never quite grasp how business works. Laughter rippled around the table. My mother added, almost cheerfully, she nearly ruined everything once. But we recovered. I stood completely still. My chest felt like something had been pressed against it. But what unsettled me more than the laughter was what I noticed next. The strangers weren't just laughing. They were watching me. Evaluating. I excused myself to get water I didn't need and stood in the kitchen for 2 full minutes, breathing. Then I started paying attention the way I was trained to, carefully, without letting anyone see that I was doing it. By the time I returned to the table, I had already caught enough fragments of conversation to understand what this evening actually was. This was not a family dinner. The printed folders near 3 of the guests. The way Owen kept referencing projected returns while passing bread. The quiet side conversations happening between my father and 2 men seated near the window. This was a pitch night. My parents were raising money, serious money, for a real estate development project. And they had humiliated me in front of potential investors deliberately, not out of careless cruelty, out of strategy. They wanted to discredit me before I could say a single word about anything financial. That realization settled into me like cold water. 7 years earlier, I had been the one running the numbers for Harper Family Holdings, my parents' property and investment company. I had joined straight out of my second corporate role when my father had asked me personally to help restructure their accounting systems. I spent 14 months building everything from scratch. Forecasting models, cash flow trackers, risk buffers, debt management schedules. I had also, at the time, strongly warned them against a rapid expansion plan that my father had grown excited about. The market timing was wrong. The financing structure was fragile. I put it all in writing. They called me overcautious. My mother said I thought too small. My father decided that my younger brother Owen, who had just finished a business degree and had never managed a real budget in his life, would take over my role. I cleared my desk and left without making a scene. I kept copies of everything I had built. Legally. Carefully. During dinner, I stopped performing politeness and started listening like a professional. Owen was presenting figures to the interested guests, projected returns on a mixed-use development in the eastern district of the city. He spoke confidently, the way people do when they've rehearsed something but don't fully understand what they're saying. But I understood it. And what I heard made my stomach tighten. The numbers he was citing were not just optimistic. They were built on assumptions that no serious analyst would accept without verification. Occupancy projections at 91% in a market currently averaging 67%. Revenue timelines that didn't account for construction delays or permit processing. Cost estimates I recognized as outdated by at least 2 years. If an experienced investor stress-tested these figures for even 30 minutes, they would fall apart. And these guests, with their quiet confidence and expensive watches, looked exactly like people who stress-tested figures for a living. After the main course, my father pulled me into the hallway. His expression had shifted from performance mode to something more private and harder to read. He told me there was a small consulting role available, reviewing documents, ensuring everything looked clean for the final investor packets. He said it would pay reasonably. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Don't embarrass us again, Evelyn. Just this once, be useful and stay quiet." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said I would think about it. He nodded and went back to his guests. But standing in that hallway, I wasn't thinking about his offer. I was thinking about a specific word he had used, clean. Not accurate. Not correct. Clean, there is a difference. And a man who spent decades in business absolutely knew that difference. He wasn't asking me to verify the numbers. He was asking me to make them look presentable. That was the moment I understood they were hiding something. I left the party at 9:15, earlier than anyone would have noticed or cared about. I drove home, changed out of my dress, and sat at my desk with tea I didn't drink. I wasn't upset anymore. I was focused. I opened the secure folder on my personal hard drive, the one containing archived copies of every document I had built or worked with during my 14 months at Harper Family Holdings. These were files I had saved legally under the consulting agreement I had signed, which gave me the right to retain copies of work product for professional reference. I hadn't opened them in over 2 years, but I opened them now. I pulled up the original financial models I had built and began cross-referencing them against what Owen had presented at dinner, based on the figures I had heard and quietly noted. The assumptions weren't just optimistic. They were built on foundations I recognized immediately as unverified. No one had done the underlying fieldwork. Someone had simply made the numbers look the way they wanted them to look. I sat with what I had found for 2 days. Not because I was unsure of what I was seeing. I was completely certain. But because I understood exactly what was at stake on every side of this decision. If I stayed silent, investors would likely commit real money to a deal built on projections that didn't hold up. People would lose funds they couldn't recover easily. The project would probably collapse mid-development, which is when losses are most painful and hardest to recoup. But if I spoke up, my parents would see it as betrayal. My brother would see it as jealousy. My family would likely cut me off completely and permanently. I had spent 7 years being the daughter who almost ruined everything. Speaking up would confirm every story they had ever told about me. I made lists. I reread the documents. I walked around my apartment at midnight talking to myself. Then, on the second evening, something unexpected arrived in my inbox that made the decision for me. The email came from a man named Franklin Osei. He had been seated near the window at dinner, one of the guests I hadn't recognized but had identified immediately as someone serious. His email was brief and professionally worded. He introduced himself as a principal at a mid-sized investment group that had been approached about the Harper project. He said he had noticed my reaction during dinner. Not the humiliation, or not only that. He had noticed the way I listened when Owen was speaking. He said he had been in enough rooms to recognize when someone in the audience understood something the presenter did not. Then he asked, plainly, were the numbers being presented accurate? I read the email 4 times. This was both an opportunity and a significant risk. If I responded carelessly, I could expose myself legally or professionally. If I responded well, carefully, factually, without emotion, I could potentially protect people who had done nothing wrong from losing serious money. I started drafting my reply. I took 3 hours to write a response that was less than 200 words. I told Franklin Osei that I was not in a position to make representations about the current state of the Harper project, as I had not been involved in its preparation. I told him that based on my professional background in financial analysis and risk assessment, I would always recommend that any investor conduct independent third-party verification of projections before committing capital, particularly in mixed-use real estate, where occupancy assumptions and construction cost estimates were highly sensitive to current market conditions. I attached nothing. I accused no one. I used no emotional language. I simply pointed him, firmly and clearly, toward doing what any responsible investor should do anyway. Then I sent it. 3 hours later, Franklin replied with 2 words, "Understood." Thank you. Brief. But I could read the space between those words. He was taking it seriously. And that changed everything. My phone rang the next morning before I had finished my first cup of coffee. It was my mother. She didn't ease into it. "Franklin Osei's office called your father this morning asking about independent verification," she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the edges of something sharp underneath it. "We don't know how they got your contact information, but they mentioned speaking with someone connected to the family." I said nothing. She continued, "Evelyn, I need you to understand something. If you sabotage this deal, for any reason, I will never forgive you. This family has worked too hard for you to destroy it out of spite." Then my father took the phone briefly and told me simply not to embarrass them again. They hung up before I could respond. I set my phone down on the counter. They were afraid. And people who are afraid of scrutiny are afraid because scrutiny finds something. I went back to my desk and kept digging. What I found next didn't come from my archived files. It came from public records, documents that anyone with patience and a professional eye could access. Filed planning applications, historic land valuations, publicly registered company accounts for the development entity Owen had incorporated 8 months earlier. I spent 2 evenings comparing what was in those filings against the figures Owen had presented at dinner. The gaps were significant. The land acquisition cost in the filing was notably higher than the figure Owen had used in his pitch, meaning the projected profit margins were being calculated from an inaccurate starting point. The company's registered accounts also showed existing liabilities that had not been mentioned in the investment presentation. None of this was necessarily criminal, but it was the kind of gap that, presented to investors without disclosure, crossed from optimism into something far more serious. The deal wasn't just risky. It was being pitched in a way that left out material information. I documented everything I found in a clear, organized report. Owen called me 2 days after my mother did. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You think you're clever," he said. "You've always thought you were the smart one. Let me tell you something, you don't understand scale. You never did. You think small because you are small." I let him talk. He went on for several minutes, cycling through versions of the same argument, that I was jealous, that I had always wanted to see them fail, that I had never been able to handle the fact that he had succeeded where I had not. I almost stopped listening. Then he said something that snapped my attention back completely. He said, "This deal closes and we're clear. Once the capital comes in, everything resets." That phrasing, "everything resets," told me exactly what I needed to know. They weren't just raising money for a new project. They were depending on incoming investor capital to cover debt that already existed. This was significantly worse than I had understood. I called Marcus IBE that same evening. Marcus was a financial advisor I had worked alongside 3 years earlier at a consulting firm, someone I trusted completely and who had no connection to my family whatsoever. I explained the situation without using names initially, walking him through the structure of the deal as I understood it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always respected about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If the incoming capital is being used to service existing debt rather than fund the project it's being raised for, and investors haven't been told that, that's not just a structure problem, Evelyn. That's a disclosure problem." He asked to see the documents. I sent everything. My archived analysis, the public filings, my comparison report. He called me back the following morning. "You need to act," he said. "And you need to do it before contracts are signed." Marcus confirmed what I had already suspected. The timeline was short. From what Owen had said during dinner and what I could piece together from the development entity's filed documents, the investment agreements were likely to be finalized within days, not weeks. Once signatures were on paper and funds transferred, the options for investors to recover anything meaningful became dramatically more limited. I had spent 2 weeks being careful, being measured, making sure I was certain before I moved. I was certain now. I spent the next 24 hours organizing everything into a formal report. Clean, structured, factual, and completely stripped of any personal or emotional language. I cited every source. I included the relevant public filing references. I noted where figures had been presented at variance with registered documents. Marcus reviewed the final version and confirmed it was professionally sound. I identified the investment group Franklin Osei represented, along with 2 other firms I had reason to believe were involved. I prepared my email. Then I waited until morning. I sent the report on a Wednesday at 8:45 in the morning. It went to Franklin Osei directly, with a note explaining that I was sharing it in my capacity as a financial analyst with prior knowledge of the underlying business and direct access to archived financial records from my time working with the entity. I stated clearly that my concerns were based on documented evidence, that I had no financial stake in the outcome, and that I was acting out of professional responsibility to ensure investors had access to accurate information before committing capital. I copied Marcus as a professional reference. Then I closed my laptop. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. I knew it would not be quiet, but I had done what the situation required, and I had done it the right way, without exaggeration, without revenge, and without a single sentence that I could not fully support with evidence. The report was solid. I was certain of that. My parents hosted a follow-up gathering 3 evenings later, smaller than the dinner, just the serious investors and Owen presenting updated materials. I knew about it because a family friend mentioned it to me without realizing the context. My parents didn't tell me. They acted, from what I could gather, as though everything was proceeding normally. Owen had apparently told them the investor interest was still strong. My father had made a reservation at a restaurant for a celebration dinner the following week. They were confident. Or they were performing confidence so consistently that they had begun to believe it themselves. I had learned over the years that these 2 things could look identical from the outside. I didn't go to the gathering. I stayed home and worked on a client project I had been neglecting. But I knew that somewhere across the city, in a room with updated slide decks and polished talking points, the ground was about to shift underneath my family in a way they were not prepared for. I heard what happened at that meeting from 2 sources independently. Franklin Osei, who sent me a brief professional update, and a family friend named Paulette who had been invited and had no reason to protect anyone's version of events. The investors arrived with questions. Specific, detailed, line-by-line questions. They referenced occupancy rate benchmarks for the Eastern District. They asked about the land acquisition cost discrepancy. They asked about the existing liabilities registered under the development entity. Owen, according to Paulette, answered the first 2 questions smoothly enough. But the third one, the liabilities, visibly broke his composure. He stumbled. He said the figure was being restructured. My father stepped in and called it a standard operational carry. The investors didn't argue. They simply made notes and said they would follow up. But the energy in the room had changed. Paulette said my father's smile, by the end of the evening, looked like something he was holding up with effort. 2 days after that meeting, Franklin Osei's firm formally requested a 30-day extension before signing any agreements, citing the need for an independent financial review of the project documentation. According to the brief update Franklin sent me, a second investor group had made a similar request within hours of hearing about the first. The phrase independent financial review was now officially in the room. My parents knew it had come from somewhere, and it didn't take long for them to understand where. My mother called me that afternoon. She didn't shout. That was almost worse. She spoke in a low, careful voice and told me that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. My father got on the line briefly and said that I had chosen enemies over family. I didn't respond to either statement. There was nothing useful I could say that would change what was happening. The facts I had shared were accurate. The investors were right to ask questions. That was all that mattered professionally. Within a week of the extension requests, the deal collapsed. Not slowly. Quickly and completely, the way structures built on fragile foundations tend to go when pressure is finally applied to the right point. Franklin's group withdrew first, citing unresolved disclosure concerns. The second group followed within 48 hours, issuing a formal written notice that referenced material inconsistencies between the pitch materials and publicly registered documents. A third smaller investor, someone my father had personally recruited through a long friendship, called and pulled out without a written explanation, which sometimes says more than any explanation could. $2 million in committed capital evaporated over the course of 4 days. The development project stalled immediately. Owen went silent on every channel. My father, according to Paulette, sat in his office for a full day without taking calls. My parents were left in a position they had not prepared for and had not believed was possible. And they knew exactly how it had happened. They came to my apartment on a Saturday morning, both of them together, which told me immediately how serious things had become. My father was the one who spoke first. He told me I had been ungrateful, that I had repaid years of family support by going behind their backs and poisoning their relationships with investors. He said I had always been difficult, always resistant, always determined to see things negatively. My mother stood slightly behind him and said nothing, but her expression held a fury that was almost physical. I let him finish. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances or bring up the dinner or repeat a single word he had said in front of those 22 guests. I looked at my father and said, I told the truth. Every figure in that report was sourced and accurate. If the deal couldn't survive the truth, the problem wasn't my report. He stared at me. Then he looked away first. That had never happened before. They sat down. I made tea because it gave everyone something to do with their hands. And then, in my own kitchen on a gray Saturday morning, my parents told me something they had clearly not planned to say. The development project had been structured to use incoming investor capital not just to fund new construction, but to service a debt obligation that had come due on an older property. A loan they had taken 3 years ago, during a difficult period they had never mentioned to me. Without the $2 million coming in, that debt had no clear path to resolution. The older property was now at risk. They were looking at the possibility of having to sell assets they had spent 20 years accumulating. My father's voice when he explained this was the quietest I had ever heard it. My mother looked at her hands. For the first time in years, I saw them not as the people who had humiliated me, but as two frightened people sitting in a hole they had dug themselves into gradually, one small compromise at a time. My mother looked up at me after a long silence. She didn't apologize directly. She wasn't built for that, and I had stopped expecting it. But she said, in a voice stripped of its usual certainty, "You understand these things better than any of us. You always did." Then she asked if I could look at their current position and tell them what their options were. The same woman who had laughed in front of 22 people while my father called me an idiot, asking me now, quietly, across my own kitchen table, to use the skills they had spent years dismissing as overcaution and small thinking. I didn't feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated and harder to name. Sadness, maybe, for all the years that had been wasted on the wrong version of our family. But I also felt, for the first time since I could remember, completely clear about who I was and what I was worth. That clarity was worth something. I told them I would not be rejoining Harper Family Holdings in any capacity. I said that clearly and without apology. But I also told them I would give them one session, professional, structured, and treated like any other client engagement, in which I would review their current financial position and outline the realistic options available to them for minimizing further damage. I said it would be done on my terms, documented properly, no pressure to soften findings, and no expectation that I would recommend anything I didn't believe was sound. My father started to say something about family loyalty. I stopped him gently. "This is the most useful thing I can offer you right now," I said. "You can take it or not." They took it. We sat at my kitchen table for 2.5 hours. I walked them through every option I could identify. Asset restructuring, debt renegotiation, a scaled-down version of the project that might still attract smaller, more patient investors if the numbers were corrected and disclosed fully. They listened. Really listened. It was the first time that had ever happened. 11 months later, I had 3 steady corporate clients, a growing reputation in risk assessment consulting, and an office I had leased myself in a building I liked. My parents sold one of the older properties to clear the debt. Owen left the company and took a salaried role at a logistics firm across the city. Harper Family Holdings still existed, but smaller, quieter, and operating with an external accountant who had been given full access to every number. My father called me once, about 6 months after that Saturday morning. He didn't say much. He asked how things were going. He said the project we had discussed was moving forward, scaled down, properly structured, fully disclosed. He said the accountant had used some of the framework I had originally built years ago as a starting reference. There was a pause. Then he said, "You were right. Back then you were right." He didn't say sorry. But I understood that for him, those 4 words were the closest thing to it. I thanked him and meant it. The night they called me an idiot in front of 22 guests was the night I stopped needing their approval. And losing the $2 million was the price they paid for never understanding the difference between someone who argues with you and someone who is trying to protect you.